Hi, this is your host, Laura Powers, and I'm so pleased to have Mark Gober back on the show. He has a new book, An End to Upside Down Living, which I think is an extremely timely topic. We'll be delving into that. He is an author, a podcast host, and he has a background in business. And if you've been listening to the show, you've heard him on the show before. Thanks so much for being a guest.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
So, fun and interesting times to be talking. So, for those who haven't listened to your first episode, can you give a background to your overall story as it relates to consciousness, spirituality, etc.?
Sure. So my background on the surface has nothing to do with spirituality or consciousness. I went to Princeton, had a very traditional education, worked on Wall Street right after that during the financial crisis. So from '08 to 2010, I was there. And then for 10 years, was part of a firm called Sherpa Technology Group, advising tech companies. And in 2016, I was listening to podcasts and I heard a show called Extreme Health Radio where I heard you, Laura, on the show. And you were talking about psychic abilities and kind of the things that you went through in your life. And that was my first exposure to paranormal or anomalous phenomena. And it piqued my interest enough to listen to your podcast. And I heard more people talking about the same thing. And it kind of snowballed from there where I started to research, looking at the scientists, reading books, and my worldview shifted very dramatically. So that led to my writing my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which I wrote in 2017 and published in 2018. Then I launched a podcast on these very same topics, which includes my interview with you, called Where is My Mind? And in 2020, I recently wrote An End to Upside Down Living. And that's the short background.
Amazing. And it's so fun for me because I psychically saw this happening and now it's all happening, which is really, really fun. And I know it's totally in alignment and you're very tapped in now intuitively, which is cool. And I do think we're in an incredible time where more and more people are being called on to shift from this purely logical, analytical, material approach to acknowledge the spiritual, emotional, energetic component. And I've seen you, going through that process. It's really exciting and cool. So tell us what An End to Upside Down Living is about on a deeper level.
So An End to Upside Down Thinking is about the brain and consciousness. So consciousness is our sense of experiencing life and our awareness. And what I challenge in An End to Upside Down Thinking is the idea that our consciousness comes from the brain, which I didn't realize until I researched that science has no idea how that could even happen.
Right.
Yet there's an assumption that the brain produces consciousness just because we know there's a strong relationship between what happens to the brain and the way our consciousness behaves. So if someone gets in a car accident and then has memory loss, we can trace where in the brain there's damage and we see a corresponding change in consciousness. But the problem that I see in my research and a lot of other people see is that it's not a causal relationship. So the brain's actually more like a filtering mechanism, or some people would say an antenna, even though it's not precise. But so if you damage the antenna, the signal hasn't been damaged. It just means the apparatus for processing the signal has been damaged. So the brain is kind of like this processor filtering mechanism. And that's what An End to Upside Down Thinking is about. I look at psychic phenomena like telepathy and things like that, and also survival of bodily death, so near-death experiences, research at the University of Virginia on children with past life memories, mediumship research. So I'll basically put all the science together, which suggests that no, the brain doesn't produce consciousness. And that means our identity is our consciousness that's beyond the body, which happens to be interconnected with kind of this broader stream of other consciousnesses into what Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, called the one mind. He said, in truth, there's only one mind. Mm-hmm. So if you accept all of that, which is, again, the first book's mostly science, there are questions about how we would live if that's true. And that was one of the big questions I got from a lot of people about the first book. Even some pretty mainstream people with a similar background to mine, they'd say, okay, I buy the science. I realize I can't shoot all of it down, but now what do I do? Because I'm still working. Right. And that's what this book is about, is kind of what would logically follow in terms of a living style and just an approach to thinking about our existence. And the second book gets much more personal than the first book. The first book I told a little bit about my story, but didn't go into it as much. This one I talk more about the journey. And I was in a pretty rough personal period right before I got into all this. And I think like some people, I wasn't looking for something new. It just kind of happened to find me. I was
when listening to podcasts. It comes in, yeah.
I must have been ready and didn't realize it, but kind of a combination of some professional disappointments, some like dating disappointments, and really at the base of it was thinking life had no meaning,
Hmm.
which was pretty rational given the way I thought reality was. I thought it was a random universe and that there was no life after death. And if you buy all that, then there isn't any meaning. So I think that was the root problem. And then certain aspects of life weren't going the way I wanted, and there was nothing to fall back on because life was meaningless.
That's, yeah, it's a pretty brutal way to look at things. And I think a lot of people view things that way. I think right now, one of the things that's happening is coronavirus is really bringing up so much fear for people. And one of the reasons is this fear of death. I mean, there's a huge fear of death in our culture and society. And I think in the world as a whole, not just our society here in the United States. And that's one of the biggest things I try to get across to people is like, look, death, the process may be a little intense, literally the crossing part, but the other side is amazing. Like there's nothing to fear from my perspective anyway, in this process. And actually I've every single near death survivor that I've connected with or spoken with has felt like it's amazing over there and it's like hard to come back. And so I just think like keep that in mind, people. Like I'm in no hurry to go, but when it's my time, I'm like, all right, let's do this. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, you said that you were in a pretty down place in your life when this kind of opened up for you. And I think that's very typical, that a lot of times we live our lives rationally, analytically, and that's certainly what I did. And that led to me actually right during the recession where, my marriage was falling apart. I lost my job. My health was a mess. I had no idea where I was going with my life. And that's when everything opened up for me. So if you're in a bad place, if you're listening to this, you're like in a bad place, you're probably going through a kind of psychic spiritual awakening from my perspective, because it seems like it's pretty consistent that people I talk to, that's what happens. Their life falls apart and then they're like, okay, let's figure this out.
Totally. That was a pattern that I've seen since listening to you when you told your story, but there's so many others. And some people call it a dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
The idea that basically we are here as part of this one mind. We're kind of like individual whirlpools in a stream, to use Bernardo Kastrup's analogy. And if we're not embodying what we're here to embody in this whirlpool, then we sort of get nudged by life. And if we don't listen to it, then the nudges become more dramatic. And I think that's what happened to me, and maybe to you as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you don't listen and the nudges become big enough, you literally will cross over. Like I've seen this with people where they don't listen to their sort of inner soul, their kind of spirit guide nudging. And then on a soul level, it's kind of like, okay, time to start again. You're not listening. And I have seen that with people where they develop, very form of aggressive cancer or something. And like, just because it's kind of like time to a do-over, time to start fresh and be able to integrate and align with whatever the soul is wanting to create here. So I'm really curious what you talk about. Are you still talking about science as well as your journey in your second book?
So I start the book talking about my journey and kind of comparing how I explain how I used to look at life and why I was critical of religion, for example, because I thought people were just believing things to comfort themselves. And while I still don't agree with every aspect of religion, I now see that there's kind of a hint of truth in many of the traditions that I was just kind of throwing away. But I start off early in the book by summarizing a lot of the science. So things like 6 sigma statistical results for telepathy, precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens, psychokinesis, which is the mind's ability to affect matter, and remote viewing, which is seeing things from far away. All those things have 6 sigma statistical results, meaning the odds that those things happen by chance in the laboratory studies is more than 1,000,000,000 to 1 against chance. So, I mean, in other areas of science, we accept things like that. And these are very often strong peer-reviewed papers with decades of results over and over again. So to me, it's the compilation of a lot of evidence in one place where it becomes hard to shoot all of it down. And so I put all that together more briefly, talk a little bit about like the philosophy as well, that this idea that consciousness is fundamental is actually philosophically preferred over the other way of looking at the world, which some would call physicalism, that all there is the physical. And I
Right.
talk about some of the just the logical errors in the physicalist view that you might not think about. So I kind of lay the groundwork for why this alternative way of looking at life, which I think is probably closer to accurate than I used to think, why that's a rational way to think. And then if we assume that, then there are a set of inferences we can make about life. And those
Hmm.
inferences are things like the potential for pre-birth planning, right?
Which is so exciting. I love that topic.
And karma, and that these things are kind of the engine of what we're doing, of how the universe works. And going back to your point about like some people kind of aborting mission if they're not doing what they came
Hmm.
here to do, it's a really important point, because if you take this perspective that we're all part of this one stream of consciousness and we're here to have a particular experience, then if we're not doing that, we're literally not embodying the reason that we're here in the first place. And that really sets in, then I think it kind of aligns one's compass differently. So just to go through the full spectrum, talk about the inference, a bunch of inferences, and then talk about approaches for living if you accept those inferences, which includes things like non-attachment, authenticity, so a bunch of principles that just make sense. And then I talk about the awakening path. So Kundalini, ego death, a lot of things that people experience on the path towards what some would call enlightenment or awakening. And then also sets of cautions, things to be aware of, and kind of the good, evil that we see, being just very discerning with a lot of different areas, and concluding with a compass for living, an overall intention for one's life that would logically follow from all of that. If we accept that view of reality, how would we align our compass for living? And I basically argue that our compass collectively as a society is way off, because we're thinking about reality incorrectly, and the world that we're seeing is a reflection of that. So if we each individually shifted our compasses, how would the external world shift?
Right. Yeah, it's really profound, and I like that you brought up the ego death aspect, because I think that's happening for a lot of people right now. And what it feels like is maybe the rug being pulled out from under you, your world falling apart.
Mhm.
Because for so many people, what you do is tied in with that ego, your livelihood, how the world works, the sense of security is tied in with that ego. And I remember during the recession when all of this was changing for me and I was going through my transformation, I literally felt like my sort of being was being ripped apart. Like it was so traumatic. Like it was one of the most intense experiences I think I've ever had. And I remember just feeling, I feel like I'm being destroyed. And in a way I was, like who I thought I was, how I approached the world, the way I lived my life was being destroyed completely. But now that I look back on it, that was a good thing, because like what was being recreated was so much better than how I was before. But the ego just wants to hold on and is terrified of change, I think, of almost any kind. And so it can feel literally terrifying when you're going through it. Did you experience that as well?
So I guess you're psychically tuning in, because
Yeah.
this is something I very specifically talk about. I talk about examples of people that have been through what they would call a terror of their ego dying. But on the other
Yeah.
side of it is a kind of enlightenment experience. But I have, which we haven't talked about, I've had an experience along those lines where the terror was so great that my body shut down the experience. So I
Mm.
felt the ego dying, like in meditation, on two different occasions, so like all kinds of intense energies coming in, and my heart was beating out of my chest. And in other cases, I've heard of that, but then people somehow went through it. And for whatever reason, my body would literally not let me surrender through it because I thought I was going to die.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
that,
no,
yeah.
it's a very strong, I think, physiological, emotional response that happened. And I remember there was one point where I was sitting in my car, I was in Denver, so, from Colorado, and I just felt it. And it was like, you know, it was literally terrifying. Like, and it was a strange thing, because I think it was a longer process, but there, for whatever reason, that one moment just really stands out. And I I've since then gone through the process of clearing out parasites in my body.
Mm.
And I feel like it was actually a similar experience when I was going through this parasite protocol, and the parasites were dying in my body. And I'm so empathic that I felt them dying, and I felt them like in terror, anxiety, like my world is being destroyed kind of thing. And it was very similar. So I think it was like the ego thing, and then is literally dying. And then like, when these beings are literally dying inside of you. And it was a very similar feeling and sensation. And it makes you wonder, like, really, what is the ego? is it actually part of us? Is it something attached to us? Like, I think I don't have an answer here, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. Do you have a theory or idea on that?
Yeah, I think it's complex. And another area in the book that I talk about is the inability of the human mind to understand reality. And the analogy I use is sort of like an amoeba who's trying to understand multivariable calculus.
Yeah.
I think that's like us.
Yeah.
So the ego, as some people would describe it, is this sense of being a whirlpool within a stream. So that means that our identity is simultaneously the full nature of reality as this one universal consciousness, while at the same time being the individual Mark or Laura or whoever. So the
Right.
ego is this false sense of being separate from the totality. But while we're separate from the totality and not separate, the separateness allows us to have certain experiences. So the question I think you're asking is, where does the line get drawn?
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Yeah. I don't think it's a clear-cut answer. I think it's complex. And I think we're also like, as we get ready, then we get to know the bigger picture. Like, I get a lot of people that ask me, well, why don't we remember our past lives? And I feel like so much of it is really intense, and it's too much. It's traumatic. It's too much for us to process. And it's only when we're ready that we are start to get that information revealed. And I think that happens with consciousness as a whole. A lot of people that are very analytical, skeptical, and are not budging, they're just literally kind of not ready for that information, is kind of what I feel like.
That's a good point, because I was really disoriented when all this happened to me, because I was in this place in my life where I was kind of hopeless in a lot of ways, even though on the surface it might not have looked so bad. Just for me,
Right.
whatever reason, there was a lot of turmoil. And then I was slapped in the face with this new worldview. And like, I didn't even know where I was. I didn't know if I was going crazy. I didn't know any other people that were interested in these topics. So when I started talking to a lot of intuitive people like you, it was interesting to hear the commonality in the messages that I was getting from everyone. Things like, you're moving towards this new sense of identity, and at some point you'll end up leaving your job and things like that, which ended up happening.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that happened with me is I went through some pretty major shifts, not just in who I was and my perspective, lifestyle, but also the people I was connecting with. I felt like as I shifted my perspective of reality and my energy, the people that I aligned with changed. And that was also very intense, because as I was going through it, it felt like I'm losing everyone, like, all of my friends, or, the people that I was close to, just, it was like not aligning. Like, we had been here, and then it was like, oh, we're not fitting anymore. Did you go through that process? Do you have a very different, social circle than you did before?
Yeah, very different. Yeah, my interests are just completely different than they used to be. So I feel that lack of alignment in certain ways. And for some people, I can still be friendly, but it's not the same kind of relationship as it used to be.
Yeah, yeah. It was interesting. I also went through big changes in terms of, you know, what I ate and drank, and, I stopped drinking alcohol. And that was one of those things where I realized, when I shifted that, how many people, like, it's like I couldn't even have a conversation. Like, it was, and by the way, I still have friends that drink. I'm not saying that I'm not friends with people who drink alcohol, but there were certain friends that I realized that alcohol was literally all that we had in common. And once I took away alcohol, it was like, there's nothing here. It was so weird. I didn't realize that till afterwards. So I'm curious, have you changed, like, literally your diet, what you put in your body, that kind of thing as well, toxins?
Yeah, very dramatically. And I've noticed that I'm much more sensitive if I cheat.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
much reductions in sugar. I feel really sensitive to sugar.
Yeah.
I rarely drink. I wasn't a huge drinker before, but now I can't tolerate it. And I have to eat clean food. Otherwise my body reacts.
Oh yeah, I'm the same. It's like immediately feeling sick, or like if I were to try to drink, I would get insta hangover, like literally, like immediately headache, nausea, the whole bit. Which I think these kinds of things are hard to convey to people who haven't gone through it, because I feel like a lot of people judge me. I think I'm just being sensitive or dramatic or something, and it's like, no, I can't do it. Like, I can't have those things the way that I used to. But if you haven't gone through that process, you don't get it. Have
Yeah.
you had that with people in your life being like, what's going on?
Yeah. And I really don't try to convince people.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
people are interested, I notice they will come to me, and I kind of leave it there. I'm just putting the information out, and I let people
Yeah.
take it if they want.
I think that's the best way to be. And I'm not trying to convince people either, but sometimes it's like almost like people like take a personal offense, like what, you don't drink, or you don't like, how come you can't have wheat or whatever. It's just kind of funny
Yeah.
how riled up people can get with it. So, I feel like there's a lot of people, like I said, that are being realigned right now. How did you know? Because we were just talking about the timing of this is very interesting for you. Were you, quit your job and you did some like traveling right before all this craziness with coronavirus hit? So how did you know? How did you know you were ready for this shift?
In the book, I talk about how do you act given this worldview, and the answer is that it's really not black and white and requires trial and error. And the four kind of methods that I've employed that I mentioned in the book. One is to always follow values, so things like integrity. Number two is following passions. So if something feels like an absolute yes, then there's something in you that's telling you that. Third is to follow intuitions, which again is not a very palpable thing, but it's sort of, you just
Right.
know it when it's there. And then fourth comes from the author Suzanne Siegel, who said to do the next obvious thing that's put in front of you. So I kind of use those as ways of going about just decisions in general. But I think what happened for me professionally is that I felt the lack of alignment more and more. And it got to
Yeah.
the point at the end of last year where I realized that I just wasn't in alignment, and it wouldn't be authentic for me, both for my colleagues and my clients, to be in that role anymore. Even though I really liked my colleagues and had
Yeah.
great clients, I mean, in a lot of ways was in an ideal situation. So I made the call to transition out of my role in late 2019, and happened to schedule a number of retreats, including 2 extended meditation retreats, which one was in mid-February and one was in early March. And I had never done
Right
extended
before it
meditation.
all went down.
Right before, and I had this impulse that I need to schedule retreats and do a lot of meditation, and I did an Ayurvedic retreat right before that. So I don't know, I guess I was attuning my body or something. But when I got back from the first meditation retreat, which was 6 nights of no talking, no gesturing, I mean, very intense.
Yeah, that is
And I
intense.
felt feeling a lot of energy during that. And I started to get a lot of insights about this next book, which I had kind of loosely been thinking about, but I hadn't opened a Word document or thought about when I was going to do it. I thought I was just kind of going to take it easy while I was phasing out of my job because I was still working part-time. When I got back from that first retreat, I wrote the whole book in a week after having gotten a lot of insights at the end of that meditation retreat, where I was taking notes for like 2 days straight. Some nights I wasn't able to sleep very well because like sentences were coming in to my mind, like it was sort of being written during the
Oh
retreat.
yeah, I've been there. It's like, I want to go to sleep. No, you're not going to sleep. You're going to channel this info instead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't feel like, at least the way I sensed it, I didn't sense another being putting something into my mind. It felt very organic, but I
Mhm.
don't know how those thoughts are being generated, or,
Yeah. I think
consciousness
it's
doesn't come to the
probably, I mean,
brain.
that's definitely, you were a part of it, but I definitely get you. They were like, here.
Right.
Yeah.
Or that's the way that I maybe get the information. For some people, they might like see the being or talk to the being. For me, it's just
Right.
like the sense comes in.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, after a week, I had this book on my hands, and then went on another meditation retreat at the beginning of March, which is when Corona started to get kind of iffy. And then I got back, and I think the Monday after I got back is when the market like dropped a lot.
Yeah.
So the timing of all this has been crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's an interesting thing because those of us who I think are really tuned in, we might do things that we're not even consciously aware of. Like I was just chatting with you before we started the interview that I typically, travel all the time. And while I had things on my calendar when all this went down, I only had one flight booked, which is super rare. You usually have like 5 or 6 flights booked, and it was using miles. So it was like really easy for me to cancel. So I think that there's a lot of people who just even unconsciously have been like, oh, something's coming, and, oriented and made some changes based on, this big shift that was happening with coronavirus. And I think on a spiritual level, this is actually a realignment. It's getting us to focus on inner healing. It's getting us to focus on the earth. Like you see all these pictures of like pollution going away in all these places and nature returning, animals returning to places where there haven't been animals. And I think this is a really deep healing on so many different levels that's needed. I do think that things will shift and go back to somewhat more of a normal, like like they were, but never quite like they were. Some of these shifts are going to be permanent. And I think that's a good thing. What's your sense from the process that you've been going through and what you've learned about that? And how can we kind of lean into that and go with the flow instead of fighting it, which is, I think a lot of people are trying to fight this right now.
Well, I agree with what you said. And going back to your earlier question, I didn't have a sense back in December or even when I scheduled the retreats that the corona was coming. I mean, I had heard from a lot of people that are very intuitive that we would be going through a shift at some point in the near future collectively, but I didn't know it was going to be corona and I didn't know it was going to happen like this. But I view it as forced rapid evolution on a collective level. It's like a friend of mine who works in the business world and has kind of been supportive of my journey and been interested in what I've been doing for the last few years. So he and a few other people have kind of been on the sidelines, like interested in what I'm doing, but still very much in the business world. And when Corona really hit, I remember he said to me, he's like, okay, Mark, now for the first time, all the things you've been doing are directly relevant to me. And that's what's happening to people, is that they're confronted with life and death. They're confronted with introspection and just so many other issues. So I think it's kind of a tough learning. It's like we weren't learning the lessons before on a collective level, so now we're being forced to.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the recession, that's what happened for me. And if the recession hadn't happened, if I'd been able to continue to work in government and politics, which, by the way, I now know is really not aligned for me as a soul, as a person, if my marriage had continued, there were so many things that if I could have, I would have continued. But their being taken away was actually a really wonderful thing. And it just basically allowed for kind of really fast development. But by the way, fast development is intense. So, if you're struggling right now or you feel like it's hard, like that is a sign of soul growth. And it can be painful, but the rewards are also just as good. Like, I feel like there is a balance of the light and the darkness. And so whatever you feel like is dark, there's equal lightness on the other side of that.
Completely agree. And this notion of evolution, I think, is really important, not from the Darwinian perspective, but from the level of consciousness, that we are here in bodies, both individually and collectively, to grow while we've been veiled from our true identity. And this is something I get into in the book. So if we think about everything from that evolutionary lens, then anything we experience, whether it's pleasant or challenging, is contributing to that evolution. So I think that might help us recontextualize things that seem challenging. If we say, okay, this is challenging, it's painful, and I'm not going to ignore the pain, but I realize that maybe it's going to help me grow in ways that I can't see right now, but in 10 years or a month, maybe I'll understand it better.
Yeah, and I think looking at it from the perspective of what am I being guided to shift, release, learn, I think that's happening on a massive scale right now for humanity, from how we treat the planet to focusing, purely externally on things, also focusing on health. Like, I think there's a lot of people who just completely ignore their health and just kind of do the work routine. And a lot of people that are getting seriously ill or passing have, some kind of chronic health issue. Not everyone, but even the ones that don't have a diagnosed health issue, I think a lot of them have something underlying that's not been diagnosed. So I think this is really highlighting the importance of tuning in, our intuition, alignment, and then also what our bodies communicate with us. Did you have any physical illness as a part of your journey? A lot of people do, but I haven't heard you talk about it, I don't think.
There are some chronic things that I dealt with for a while that during this transition period, I think diet and nutrition helped get rid of, but I'm still very sensitive. So I think that kind of physical illness or ailments can be perhaps manifestations of some kind of misalignment, or I don't know, something on a level beyond what we're just told by doctors, even though there's merit to that, but I think there's more to the picture.
Absolutely. For me, I definitely had physical things going on, but once I left my relationship, left my particular way I was making a living, a lot of my health issues just like went away, like literally, like bam, like they're gone, and there were still things that I had to work on, but I think that's happening for a lot of people. And it's a tough thing because you go to, the experts that, doctors and, people of different specialties, and they're approaching it the only way that they know how. But I feel like part of what we're being to do as a people is to like bridge these gaps, like, so more and more doctors that are also looking at the emotional spiritual aspect, and same thing, even spiritual people, like we need to acknowledge the physical as that there is something going on there. I think sometimes I see, for example, people that are in the sort of spiritual conscious community, almost denying or ignoring the medical and the science aspect. And I'm like, no, we need to not ignore it. We need to like say, what is this telling us? Like, how can we integrate these two sides?
Right.
And it's like, it's so polarized. And it's interesting because I have, people in my family and people I'm very close to that are in medicine. And then I'm also very much in the sort of spiritual side. I've not personally, explored the scientific medical approach, but at the same time, I've recognized on a spiritual level how we really need to be integrating rather than separating, which I think is where we are right now. Unfortunately, everything is very separate.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a danger in my old perspective, this physicalist worldview that everything's physical and there's nothing spiritual. But then the other end of the pendulum, if it swings too far, is that there's only spiritual and there's nothing
Yes.
really physical, which the paradox is that we have to hold both together, that there is the physical aspect and then there's the non-physical aspect. And I completely agree that this is one of the dangers that can occur where people go too far in either direction, and it's both.
Yes. Yeah. It's a very strange thing. I feel sometimes like I'm trying to balance that and walk that line, and it's tricky, but I think that's in a way what we're all being called to do right now. So I feel like you're going to write more books, and I think this is just the start. And I'm very curious to see, the evolution of Mark and what you put out there. It's very, very fun and exciting. For people who are going through their own transformation, realignment, awakening, what guidance would you have to help them in their journey?
Well, the way I frame the second book is, like I said, a compass for life, an orientation. And when we set the compass in a certain direction, the behavior will ultimately kind of go that way. And it might take time, and it might take time to shed old habits. So I think the understanding that when we set the intention and point the arrow in a certain direction, that's kind of the key step. And the change might not be overnight. And for me, it certainly hasn't been. I mean, it's been 3.5 years, and I feel like I'm still shedding a lot, and there's still a lot of growth that's occurring, and it wasn't always like fully pleasant on the way up. It's kind of been bumpy, but that's a typical part of the process. So if people are going through difficult times as they've already reoriented their compass, that's a natural thing. And like you said, when there are challenges, that can be a really good thing because it indicates that there's growth. So I think that's one thing I would say. And another thing that's popping up for me is remembering the notion of interconnectivity. So we are an individual, that's part of it, but we're also part of the whole. And remembering that part of the reason we're here, in addition to evolving ourselves, is to help the whole evolve, because that's our identity also. And I had a full podcast episode in my series, Where is My Mind, on what's known as the life review phenomenon. So this is where a person is in a near-death experience state. And near-death experience is when a person's brain is basically off. So they might be in cardiac arrest. There's little or no brain functioning, and yet they have these incredibly lucid experiences. And one of the things people often report is a life review, where they go through their entire life in a flash. So they relive every event, but they often relive the events through the eyes of all the people that they impacted. And for example, I interviewed Daniel Brinkley, who's had 4 near-death experiences, and each time he had a life review.
Wow, that's intense.
It's intense, because not everyone will remember their life review, or maybe not everyone has 4 near-death experiences. So
No, it's pretty rare.
So he was electrocuted once by being struck by lightning, and he had open heart surgery twice and brain surgery. During his near-death experience, he relived his combat days in Vietnam. And he told me, he's like, Mark, I was a big guy, I was vicious in combat, and I had to relive the deaths of the people that I killed through their eyes. And then he felt the pain of a child who would no longer have a father. He felt the indirect effects
Wow.
of his actions. So now his life was transformed, obviously. He became a hospice volunteer. And each time as he's gone back through his life review, since he's done it 4 times, he's had to start at the beginning. That's the way it's been done for him. So he's relived certain horrible things 4 times, but he's also seen his own progression through the eyes of other people. So as a hospice volunteer, he's helped other vets cross over to the other side. He sits at the bedside with them. So he's been able to see people looking at him during his life review. and to see what that impact had of his kind action. So I think that's a really important part of this overall compass, even as we are going through whatever turbulence we're going through, or maybe it's great, maybe it's not, is to remember that our own evolution is important, but we're contributing to others as well. So to really be mindful of our actions.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I love that scene in It's a Wonderful Life, when the angel comes and they show like if he'd never been born,
Mm-hmm.
how the world would have been impacted. And the truth is it is hard for us to know what our impact is, both on the side that you're talking about where, what kind of pain or suffering have you caused someone, as well as what kind of light have you brought into people's lives. We don't always truly know our impact. And it is important to remember that we all have things that we're here to teach. And to me, that's, in sort of spiritual terms, we think that is our life mission, our purpose. What are we here to do? And then we have things that we're learning. So every one of us, if we're here incarnated, we have something to teach and we have something to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of what keeps us here. And that life purpose aspect is so important. And I have found that when you align with your life purpose, other things fall into place. So I find a lot of people get really caught up in the analytical, like I don't have the money to do XYZ that I'm being guided to do, or I don't know how to do that, or, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of stories that we tell ourselves. But the truth is, if something is aligned for us, if it's part of our life purpose, it will happen. And it's just a matter of us kind of allowing for it to occur.
Totally. Yeah. My book has a section on the notion of surrender, which is really this attitude of allowing. And it's the opposite of what we're taught. If you think this physicalist view is correct, that it's all random, then we have to control everything, even though we couldn't even do it from a physicalist perspective because the universe has so much physical stuff beyond our control. But from this perspective, where there is this spiritual reality, then there is an underlying intelligence beyond our own individuality that we're kind of tapping into and are a part of. And so there's things happening beyond our individual conscious control. And when you kind of align yourself with the stream, with the current within the stream, so to speak, then you let the current carry you. And that's a mindset shift that is,
Yeah.
it takes time to really accept that. But I think it comes from the notion of humility, the recognition that we're the amoeba and it's multivariable calculus. We can't understand what's happening, but there is multivariable calculus. So why not just say, I'm going to surrender to that, try to take in that intelligence whenever I can through things like meditation or just intuition, and not get attached to the outcomes because I can't control the outcomes.
Yeah, and also that when spirit is determined something will happen, no matter how seemingly unlikely, it will happen. Like we don't have to create that. We just, like you said, you have to just surrender and kind of allow for it and not fight it. I had a really interesting client, and she just tagged a post about this the other day, where I had been talking in the reading about her husband's livelihood and lifestyle. And I got that this was 6 months ago. I said, in 6 months, he's going to be working from home. And this is someone who works in entertainment in Los Angeles and, at a studio. And it was like, how in the world is he going to work from home? Well, sure enough, here we are 6 months later because of coronavirus, he's working from home. So, that we don't have to figure it out. We just have to take that next step. I think you brought that up a little earlier. Just take the step that's aligning for you in front of you. And then you don't have to figure out the end game. You don't have to figure out how you get there. You just have to take each step as it comes. And that takes off an enormous amount of pressure, but it is hard when you're used to trying to do every single step yourself and figure it all out and map it all out. It's like a totally different way to operate.
Yeah, well, it's like the Tony Robbins saying that life is happening for you, not to you. And when I first heard that years ago, I didn't really understand it. But now metaphysically, that's a profound statement, that we are here to evolve, and everything that happens in our life is a mechanism for us to evolve. So when we interpret the external world that way, we say, oh, wait, how can I learn? And then, like you were saying, you can take it one step at a time. Like Suzanne Siegel said, you follow the next obvious thing. And it does take the pressure off to say that there is stuff going on beyond my control. I'm just going to do what's in front of me, follow values and intuition and passions, and that's the best I can do.
Yeah, and I'm getting to say that when you follow that sooner than later, it's easier. It's when we fight it that things feel really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the hard part is sometimes that ego releasing and stepping forward even when we don't know how it's going to manifest. So when I very first was tapping in and learning how to connect, I was guided to go travel in Europe, and I was unemployed. The recession was happening, and I was like, what the heck? Like, how am I supposed to do this? And I was just learning how to trust, as well as learning to use my intuition. And I just was like, all right, I'm being guided to do this. I had had an angelic visitation experience. I was trusting more and more. And I went to Spain for a month with $500 for accommodation, for food, for everything, which, that's not very much, I'll just say. But sure enough, when I got there, I received an unexpected sum of money that funded, what I needed. And if I hadn't listened, things wouldn't have unfolded in the way that my guides were trying to allow for things to unfold. So, if you're getting a message, it's so hard sometimes to listen, to trust, and to step forward. But I have found that, the universe literally rises up to meet us when we do that.
Right. But there is a parachute always.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, this has been really fun. It's so exciting to see everything happening for you. I'm really looking forward to this next book. And I know that so many people are going to benefit from reading it. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up for today?
No, I think we covered a lot. Thank you again for having me, and thank you for playing such an important role in this journey. The book I talk about, how I heard you on the podcast and listened to the powers, and so I mentioned it. And it's funny, when I did my first psychic session with you, I've done with other psychics as well, you talked about that I would be writing. And at the time, that was completely not in my realm of thinking. And you said there would come a point when my professional life and this other life would not be compatible anymore, and I would have to split. So it's just very funny to see this unfolding.
It is. And it's great because I as a psychic, I can feel how people are responding to what I say. And I remember you feeling like, like, I don't know, like, so as a psychic, I have learned not to like take it personally however someone's responding, because I'm like, that they're wherever they are, and like, and then it just unfolds. And I've certainly had a lot of people respond, like sometimes years after, something came up in a reading, being like, yeah, you said that, it didn't make sense to me, but now it's, happening or whatever. So, and I think that's an important thing, whether or not you're psychic, just like people are responding how they're responding, and it's not our place to,
Right. Always.
take it
We
personally.
control our reactions is what we can control.
Yeah, but this is so amazing for me to see that. And also one thing I want to share that you mentioned is, you heard me on this radio show, which is not that big. And sometimes we're guided to do things and we may even never know why. In this case, I do that show. I feel like a lot of me being on that show was for this to unfold. But just to honor what's coming forward, if you're getting an intuitive nudge for it. And the same thing for you. Like, you just, listened to this podcast. I'm sure you had no idea what a big impact it would have for you.
No way. No clue. It's crazy to think about.
It's so fun. I love it. By the way, just a fun and funny thing. So if you're listening to audio only, I just want to say something about what we're wearing. So when I first started my video podcast and doing videos, I had like 4 guests in a row where the guests showed up and these were in person, and I was wearing the same color that they were wearing, and we are wearing the same color. And it's funny, when I was getting dressed this morning, and this is the only thing that this color, I'm like, this is not normally something I'd wear, but I'm like feeling to wear it. Like, I really think we're matching. Anyway, that's so funny. Oh, this is great. Well, always fun to talk with you, Mark. If people want to learn more about you, connect with you, get your book, how can people do that?
My website is markgober.com, markgober.com. My podcast, Where's My Mind, is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major podcasts. And then Amazon is a good place to find my 2 books, An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living.
So I'm just getting to ask, are you planning on doing, teaching, workshops, obviously online for the moment, but I'm definitely getting that's where the guys are wanting to go.
When I made the decision to transition out of my job, I didn't have a specific next step. I mean, I thought at some point I might write a book, but I didn't know when or what exactly it was going to be on. And as of now, when we're recording it, the book process is just completing. So I haven't really had time to think about exactly what's next. I'm always researching, but I don't know where I'm going next.
Nice. Well, it's exciting times. Very, very
Yeah.
cool. Well, thank you again, Mark. It's been a
Okay.
pleasure.
Thank you, Laura.
And thank everybody for listening. If you'd like more information about me, you can go to my website, healingpowers.net. You can find me at Twitter at Laura Powers, Instagram at Laura Powers 44, and on Facebook at Healing Powers. Thanks for listening and your support.